Trevor and I had been inseparable since we were 8 years old. While other kids built sandcastles, we built empires in my backyard. Elaborate kingdoms with stick armies and rock fortresses that would last until Mom called us in for dinner. He was the brother I never had, the constant in every major moment of my life. When I met Elena at a gallery opening 7 years ago, Trevor was the first person I called. "You have to meet her," I told him, practically breathless with excitement. "She's incredible, brilliant, beautiful, and she actually laughed at my terrible jokes about municipal bonds." Elena was everything I wasn't. Where I calculated risk and planned for retirement accounts, she created beauty from nothing. Her interior design work transformed sterile spaces into warm homes, much like how she transformed my carefully ordered life into something vibrant and unpredictable. "She's perfect for you," Trevor said after meeting her at our engagement party. "Just promise me you won't become one of those guys who disappears when he gets married." "Never," I assured him, clapping his shoulder. "Bros before, well, you know." Elena laughed when I told her about the conversation later. "Don't worry," she said, curling up against me on the couch. "I'm not the jealous type. Trevor's family." The wedding was everything Elena dreamed of. Elegant, expensive, and photographed from every angle. Trevor's best man speech brought the house down, telling embarrassing stories about our childhood adventures while somehow making them sound noble and heroic. Elena beamed throughout the entire reception, the picture of a perfect bride. Our first few years of marriage felt like a fairy tale. Elena's design business flourished, and my financial planning practice grew steadily. We bought a beautiful colonial in the suburbs, which Elena transformed into something that belonged in a magazine. Trevor became a regular fixture at our dinner parties, often staying late to help clean up or just to talk. "You two are disgusting," Trevor would joke when Elena and I would share some inside joke or finish each other's sentences, like a Hallmark card come to life. But even fairy tales have shadows. I started noticing small things. How Elena's phone was always face down during dinner, how she'd step outside to take certain calls, how she'd sometimes return from errands with a flush in her cheeks and a distracted air. When I mentioned it to Trevor during one of our monthly golf games, he brushed off my concerns. "Marriage paranoia," he said, lining up his shot. "Sarah went through the same phase. You're just adjusting to having someone else's life intertwined with yours." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. Trevor's voice was different, smaller somehow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Nathan, I need to tell you something. Can you meet me at Henderson's Diner? Now?" My hands were shaking as I drove across town. Trevor looked like he'd aged a decade since our last golf game 2 weeks earlier. His face was gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. "I have pancreatic cancer," he said without preamble, his coffee cup trembling in his hands. "Stage 4. They're giving me maybe 6 months." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, mouth opening and closing like a fish, trying to process what he'd just said. My best friend, my brother in everything but blood, was dying. "How long have you known?" I finally managed. 8 months, he whispered, not meeting my eyes. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but—" He trailed off, staring into his coffee like it held answers. 8 months. 8 months of him carrying this alone while I complained about client portfolios and Elena's expensive taste in furniture. 8 months of him smiling and joking and pretending everything was normal. "We'll get through this," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his shoulder. The best doctors, experimental treatments, whatever it takes. Trevor gave me a sad smile. Always the planner. That's why I need you to know something else. His voice dropped even lower. I haven't been a good friend to you, Nathan. I've done something terrible. Before I could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face went white. I have to go, he said, standing abruptly. Doctor's appointment. We'll talk more later, okay? I watched him leave, my mind reeling. In all our years of friendship, I'd never seen Trevor look so broken, so defeated. I wanted to follow him, to demand answers about what he'd done that was so terrible. But something in his expression told me to wait. Over the next few weeks, Trevor's condition deteriorated rapidly. He lost weight at an alarming rate, and the treatments left him weak and nauseous. Elena and I took turns bringing him meals and keeping him company during his chemotherapy sessions. You don't have to do this, he told Elena one afternoon as she arranged flowers in his hospital room. You have your own life to worry about? Nonsense, Elena replied, her voice warm with compassion. Your family. We take care of family. I felt a surge of love for my wife in that moment. Despite her busy schedule, she never complained about the time we spent at the hospital. She brought Trevor his favorite books, coordinated meal deliveries from his friends, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to lift his spirits. You're lucky, Trevor told me one evening as Elena stepped out to get coffee. She's 1 in a million. I know, I said, watching her through the window as she chatted with a nurse. I don't know what I'd do without her. Something flickered across Trevor's face. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But before I could ask about it, Elena returned with coffee and homemade cookies, and the moment passed. The end came faster than anyone expected. I got the call at 3 a.m. on a Thursday from Margaret, Trevor's mother. You need to come now, she said, her voice thick with tears. The doctors say it's time. Elena and I threw on clothes and raced to the hospital. Trevor was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Margaret sat beside his bed, holding his hand and whispering prayers. Nathan, Trevor whispered when he saw me approach. His voice was so weak I had to lean down to hear him. I need to tell you something. Something I should have said months ago. Save your strength, I said, my throat tight with emotion. You can tell me when you're feeling better. No. His grip on my hand was surprisingly strong. Listen to me. I've been sleeping with Elena. For 5 years. I'm so sorry. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I stared down at my dying best friend, certain I'd misheard him. What? I whispered. 5 years, he repeated, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. I loved her first, Nathan, before you met her. We were together for 2 years before that gallery opening where you met her. She chose you because you could provide for her in ways I couldn't. But we never stopped. My vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt sideways. That can't be. She knew, Trevor continued, his voice barely audible now. About the cancer. She's known for months. She kept seeing me even while I was dying, even during the treatments. I'm sorry, Nathan. I'm so sorry. The machines around his bed began beeping frantically. Nurses rushed in, pushing me aside as they worked to stabilize him. But it was too late. Trevor Moss died at 4:17 a.m., taking my entire world with him. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot until the sun came up, staring at nothing. Every memory from the past 5 years was now contaminated. Every moment of happiness poisoned by betrayal. Elena's compassion at Trevor's bedside wasn't kindness, It was guilt. Her frequent errands weren't running her business. They were running to my best friend's bed. When I finally went home, Elena was waiting in the kitchen, still in her robe, coffee growing cold in her hands. "How is he?" she asked, and I marveled at how genuine her concern sounded. "He's dead," I said flatly. Elena's face crumpled. She set down her coffee cup with shaky hands and moved toward me, arms outstretched for comfort. I stepped back. "I need to pack a bag," I said, heading for the stairs. "Pack a bag?" "Nathan, what are you talking about? You're in shock. You need to sit down. Let me help you process this." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to face my wife of 5 years. She looked beautiful even in her grief, tears making her green eyes luminous, her auburn hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. For a moment, I could almost understand why Trevor had risked everything for her. "How long?" I asked quietly. The color drained from Elena's face. "How long what? How long have you been sleeping with Trevor?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Elena's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. That was all the confirmation I needed. I walked upstairs and packed a suitcase while Elena stood frozen in the kitchen. When I came back down, she was sitting at the breakfast bar, her head in her hands. "Nathan, please let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," I said, setting my suitcase by the door. "He told me everything." Elena's head snapped up. "He what? When?" "Right before he died." 5 years, Elena. 5 years you've been lying to my face, sleeping in my bed, playing the perfect wife while screwing my best friend behind my back. It wasn't like that. He said you knew about the cancer, that you kept seeing him even while he was dying. Elena's face went chalk white. "Nathan, you have to understand." "I don't have to understand anything," I said, picking up my suitcase. "I have to leave before I do something we'll both regret." I walked out of our house and didn't look back. Elena's calls followed me to my car, but I didn't stop. I couldn't trust myself to stay in the same room with her for another second. I checked into an extended stay hotel across town and turned off my phone. For the first time in 15 years, I was completely alone. No wife, no best friend, no carefully constructed life to maintain. Just me and the crushing weight of betrayal. The next few days passed in a blur. Elena called constantly. She showed up at my office, tearful and desperate, begging me to listen to her side of the story. I had security escort her out. She left flowers, letters, voicemails full of explanations and apologies and promises that it was over, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she loved only me. But I kept hearing Trevor's words. "She chose you because you could provide for her in ways I couldn't." On the fourth day, I hired a private investigator named Blake Donovan. If I was going to destroy my marriage, I wanted to know exactly what I was destroying. "I need everything," I told Blake, sliding a check across his desk. "Phone records, financial records, credit card statements, surveillance footage, everything you can legally obtain." Blake was a thin man with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that suggested military training. "How far back?" 5 years, maybe longer." "Any particular focus?" "I want to know how long my wife has been cheating on me with my best friend, and I want proof that will hold up in court." Blake nodded without expression. "I'll have preliminary findings within 48 hours." What he found was worse than I'd imagined. Elena and Trevor's relationship hadn't just lasted through our entire marriage. It had started years before I existed in the picture. The gallery opening where she'd caught my eye had been orchestrated. Your friend was struggling financially, Blake explained, spreading photos and documents across his desk. Freelance graphic design, irregular income, living paycheck to paycheck. Your wife had expensive tastes even then. Designer clothes, high-end restaurants, luxury vacations she couldn't afford on a teacher's salary. I stared at the evidence. Elena had been a substitute teacher when I met her, supposedly saving money to start her interior design business. I'd been charmed by her ambition and eager to support her dreams. The relationship ended when she realized Trevor couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted, Blake continued. But according to these phone records, she maintained contact. When she decided you were a viable alternative, she engineered the meeting. Blake showed me credit card records from before our marriage. Elena had been accumulating debt, luxury purchases she couldn't sustain on her income. The gallery opening wasn't chance. She'd researched the guest list, identified successful single men, and positioned herself strategically. Your friend had suggested targeting you specifically, Blake explained. Recent promotion to senior advisor, no serious relationships, and according to their text messages, lonely enough to fall fast and grateful enough to be generous. The photos were devastating. Elena and Trevor at restaurants I'd never been to, holding hands across candle-lit tables. Elena and Trevor entering hotels during my business trips. Elena and Trevor at his apartment building, sometimes multiple times per week. But the medical records were what truly shattered me. Your friend was diagnosed 8 months ago, Blake continued. These records from his oncologist show your wife was listed as his emergency contact. She attended every appointment, Nathan. She knew from day one that he was dying. I stared at the documentation, my hands shaking. She kept seeing him while he was sick? The hotel visits actually increased after his diagnosis. And there's more. Blake pulled out a thick folder of printed text messages. I was able to recover deleted conversations from Trevor's phone. Your wife wasn't exactly the caring, supportive friend she appeared to be. The messages were brutal. Elena complaining about Trevor being too weak during his treatments. Her suggesting experimental therapies not out of hope, but to extend their affair. Her discussing how to maintain their relationship without Nathan getting suspicious, while Trevor was literally dying. One message in particular made my stomach turn. Can't you take stronger painkillers? You're useless like this. This was sent during Trevor's final week, when he could barely keep food down. There's something else, Blake said, his voice gentler now. Your wife has been telling people a very different story about your separation. He showed me social media screenshots, witness statements from mutual friends. Elena had crafted a narrative where she was the grieving friend, devastated by Trevor's death, and I was the cruel husband who'd abandoned her in her darkest hour. She's gained significant sympathy, Blake continued. Your mutual friends believe you're having some kind of breakdown, that you've left your wife when she needs you most. She's playing the victim expertly. I felt a cold fury settle in my chest. Even now, even after being caught, Elena was manipulating the situation to her advantage. She was winning the court of public opinion while I hid in a hotel room like the guilty party. I want more, I told Blake. Everything you can find, every lie, every manipulation, every moment of cruelty. I want to know exactly who I married. What's your endgame here, Nathan? Blake asked carefully. Divorce with favorable terms? Financial protection? I thought about Trevor's final moments, how he'd used his last breath to confess. how Elena had performed grief at his bedside while secretly resenting his weakness, how she was now spinning his death into sympathy for herself. Public humiliation, I said finally. I want everyone who knows us to see exactly what she is. Blake raised an eyebrow. That's going to require perfect timing and execution. One wrong move, and she turns you into the vindictive ex-husband. Then we better not make any wrong moves. Over the next 2 weeks, Blake compiled a comprehensive dossier of Elena's deception. Credit card records showing expensive gifts for Trevor that I'd unknowingly paid for. GPS data from her car showing she'd visited his apartment over 300 times in the past 2 years. Security footage from his oncology center showing her accompanying him to treatments while telling me she was meeting clients. But the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Blake had managed to recover additional deleted text messages, including conversations between Elena and her sister Samantha. "You need to see this," Blake said, sliding a printed conversation across his desk. The messages were from the week after Trevor's diagnosis. Elena wasn't discussing grief or fear for her lover's life. She was strategizing. Elena: "If he dies, I need to make sure Nathan never finds out. How do I play the grieving friend without arousing suspicion?" Samantha: "You've been doing it for years already. Just amp up the caring act. Maybe suggest couples therapy to work through the trauma of losing a friend." Elena: "Good idea. I can spin this into making our marriage stronger. Nathan's so trusting he'll never question it." The conversation continued in this vein for pages. Elena discussing how to use Trevor's death to manipulate me into being a more attentive husband. Her planning to suggest we have children soon, while Nathan's feeling vulnerable and clingy. Reading those messages, I realized I'd never known my wife at all. The woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd built a life with, was a complete fabrication. Elena wasn't just unfaithful, she was fundamentally incapable of genuine emotion. "I've seen a lot of marital deception," Blake said quietly. "But this level of calculated manipulation is unusual. Your wife isn't just an adulterer, Nathan. She's a sociopath." I thought about Elena's perfect tears at Trevor's bedside, her seemingly genuine compassion for his suffering. How she'd comforted his mother, Margaret, brought flowers to brighten his room, held my hand during the worst moments. All of it performance. All of it calculated to maintain her cover. "The wake is in 10 days, I said. "I want her destroyed there." Blake leaned back in his chair. "You're talking about nuclear revenge. Once you do this, there's no going back. Your wife will be ruined, but so will any chance of a quiet divorce." "Good," I said. "I don't want quiet. I want biblical." That afternoon, I did something that went against every instinct I had. I went home. Elena's car was in the driveway when I pulled up. I sat in my car for several minutes, steeling myself for what I had to do. Then I walked through the front door like nothing had happened. "Nathan!" Elena rushed toward me from the kitchen, her face a masterpiece of relief and joy. "You came home! I was so worried I didn't know if you'd ever—" "I'm sorry," I said, pulling her into a hug that made my skin crawl. Trevor's death hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't thinking clearly. Elena pulled back to look at my face, her eyes searching for deception. "You were so angry when you left. The things you said—" "Grief makes people say terrible things," I replied, stroking her cheek with a tenderness I didn't feel. "I can't imagine how you must have felt, losing such a close friend and then having your husband abandon you on top of it." Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. Perfectly timed, perfectly performed. I thought I'd lost you too. First Trevor, then you. I couldn't bear it. You'll never lose me, I lied, kissing her forehead. We're going to get through this together. In fact, I think we should help Margaret plan the wake. Trevor deserves the best send-off we can give him. Elena's relief was palpable. Her shoulders dropped from their tense position near her ears, and she exhaled a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. She'd been expecting a battle, possibly divorce proceedings, certainly more questions about Trevor's confession. Instead, I was offering reconciliation and an opportunity to cement her false narrative. That's a wonderful idea, she said, her voice brightening for the first time since I'd returned. Her hands, which had been fidgeting with her wedding ring, finally stilled. You're so compassionate, I said, marveling at how easily the words came. It's one of the things I love most about you. The way you cared for Trevor during his illness. I don't know how he would have gotten through it without you. Elena's smile faltered for just a moment. So brief I might have imagined it. He was family, she said. You don't abandon family when they need you most. Over the next week, I threw myself into playing the reconciled husband. I brought Elena flowers, took her out to dinner, and even suggested we start trying for children once we'd processed our grief over Trevor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was giving my sociopathic wife everything she'd planned to manipulate me into anyway. Elena responded beautifully to my apparent forgiveness. She was more affectionate than she'd been in months, more attentive to my needs, more invested in our marriage, the guilty party trying to overcompensate, or the manipulator who thought she'd successfully controlled the narrative. Either way, it made me sick. I moved back into our bedroom but claimed nightmares about Trevor were affecting my sleep. Elena was sympathetic and suggested I see a counselor. I slept on the couch instead, claiming the bedroom reminded me too much of Trevor's visits to our house. Maybe we should redecorate, Elena suggested one morning over breakfast. Create some new memories to replace the painful ones. After the wake, I said. Right now, I want to focus on honoring Trevor's memory properly. Elena threw herself into wake preparations with enthusiasm that would have been touching if I didn't know the truth. She coordinated with the funeral home, arranged catering, and even wrote a beautiful eulogy about Trevor's noble spirit and courage in the face of adversity. You should speak first, I suggested as she practiced her speech. You knew him so well, especially during these last few months. Your perspective on his final days would mean everything to Margaret. Are you sure? Elena asked. I don't want to overstep. You were his best friend. And you were the friend who was there when he needed it most, I replied. The friend who held his hand through chemotherapy, who brought him comfort in his darkest hours. Margaret needs to hear about that side of Trevor, the man who found strength through friendship even while dying. Elena beamed at my words. I'll make sure everyone knows what a fighter he was, how he never gave up hope, even at the end. I nodded encouragingly while my stomach churned. Elena's version of Trevor's fighting spirit involved him enduring her cruelty and indifference while battling cancer. Her comfort had been demanding better performance in bed during his treatments. But I let her practice her lies. I even offered suggestions to make her speech more moving, more personal. I wanted Elena to dig her own grave as deep as possible before I buried her in it. Meanwhile, Blake was making final preparations. The wake would be held at Margaret's church, a large sanctuary that could accommodate the expected crowd. Trevor had been well loved in our community. Colleagues, old friends, extended family and neighbors would all be there to pay respects. I've arranged for large screens throughout the sanctuary, Blake reported, ostensibly for a photo memorial, but they'll display whatever we want them to. The audio system is set up for speeches, but I've added some additional capabilities. Hidden cameras? Positioned to capture your wife's reaction from multiple angles. This will be thoroughly documented. What about the evidence? Blake patted a briefcase beside his chair. Everything we discussed. Photos, text messages, medical records, financial documentation. I've also prepared copies for key attendees. Margaret, your wife's sister, selected friends and family members. Once this starts, there will be no containing it. I felt a flicker of doubt. What I was planning would destroy Elena, but it would also devastate Margaret and turn Trevor's funeral into a spectacle. Are you sure there's no other way? Your wife has been manipulating people for 5 years, Blake reminded me. She's convinced your entire social circle that you're the villain in this story. A private confrontation won't work. She'll spin it, deny it, or claim you're having a breakdown. Public exposure is the only way to prevent her from continuing to control the narrative. He was right. Elena had already proven her ability to manipulate perception. If I confronted her privately, she'd find a way to make me the bad guy. But if I exposed her publicly, in front of everyone who mattered, there would be no recovery. Trevor asked me to do this, I said, more to convince myself than Blake. His final words were a confession. He wanted the truth to come out. Then let's make sure it does. The morning of the wake dawned gray and drizzly, appropriately somber for the occasion. Elena spent extra time getting ready, choosing a conservative black dress that managed to be both respectful and flattering. "Do I look okay?" she asked, adjusting her jewelry in the mirror. "I want to look appropriate for Margaret's sake." "You look perfect," I said, straightening my tie. "Trevor would have appreciated you making such an effort for his send-off." Elena smiled sadly. "I just wish he could see how many people loved him. I think he sometimes felt alone, especially after the diagnosis." The lies came so easily to her. Trevor hadn't felt alone. He'd felt guilty and manipulated and used by the woman standing before me. But Elena had rewritten history in her mind, casting herself as the caring friend rather than the predator who'd exploited a dying man's weakness. We arrived at the church to find the parking lot already filling up. Margaret stood near the entrance, greeting mourners with dignity despite her obvious grief. When she saw Elena, she pulled her into a fierce hug. "Thank you for everything you did for my son," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He told me how much your visits meant to him, especially when the treatments made him so sick. You were a blessing in his final months." Elena returned the hug with apparent warmth. "Trevor was like family to us. I only wish we could have done more." "You did enough," Margaret assured her. "More than enough. I don't know how he would have faced those final weeks without friends like you and Nathan." I watched this exchange with growing rage. Margaret's gratitude was genuine. She truly believed Elena had been a source of comfort for her dying son. She had no idea that the woman she was thanking had been complaining about Trevor's weakness and demanding better sexual performance while he battled for his life. The sanctuary was already half full when we entered. The front rows were reserved for family, with Elena and me seated prominently near Margaret. Large screens displayed a slideshow of photos from Trevor's life. Childhood pictures, college memories, professional achievements, candid shots from our many dinner parties and vacations. Elena watched the slideshow with apparent emotion, dabbing at her eyes when photos of the three of us appeared. "Look how happy he was," she murmured to me. "He really did love life, didn't he?" "Yes," I said quietly. "He loved life, and he loved people who loved him back." As the service began, I counted the attendees. Nearly 200 people had come to honor Trevor's memory. Friends, family, colleagues, neighbors, all of them believing they were mourning a man who died surrounded by love and support. None of them knowing that his final months had been poisoned by manipulation and cruelty. Father Timothy delivered the opening remarks, speaking about Trevor's character and faith. Then Margaret stood to share memories of her son's childhood, her voice breaking as she described his kindness and generosity. "Trevor never met a stranger," she said, looking out at the packed sanctuary. "He had a gift for making people feel valued, for bringing out the best in everyone around him. Even during his illness, he was more concerned about the burden his care placed on others than his own suffering." I glanced at Elena, who was nodding sadly at Margaret's words. She knew better than anyone how Trevor had suffered, and not just from cancer. She'd added emotional cruelty to his physical pain, yet she sat there accepting praise for her supposed compassion. "I'd like to invite Elena Caldwell to share some thoughts," Father Timothy announced. Elena was particularly close to Trevor during his final months, and she has some beautiful words about his courage. Elena rose gracefully and made her way to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces with appropriate solemnity, then began her prepared remarks. "Trevor was the bravest person I've ever known," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "When he received his diagnosis, his first concern wasn't for himself. It was for the people who loved him. He worried about being a burden, about causing us pain through his suffering." The congregation was hanging on every word. Elena had always been a compelling speaker, and grief gave her performance an extra layer of authenticity. "But Trevor was never a burden," she continued. "Spending time with him during his treatments, watching him fight with such dignity and grace, it was a privilege. He taught me about courage, about facing the impossible with faith and hope." I felt bile rise in my throat. Elena's privilege of spending time with Trevor during treatments had involved sexual encounters in hospital parking lots and complaints about his declining performance. Her lessons about courage had come from watching him endure her cruelty while too weak to fight back. "Trevor cherished every moment he had left," Elena went on, her voice beginning to break with what sounded like genuine emotion. "He treasured his friendships, his family, the simple pleasures that make life worth living. He never stopped believing that love could overcome any obstacle, even death itself." The congregation was deeply moved. I could see tears in many eyes, nods of agreement throughout the sanctuary. Elena was giving them exactly what they needed to hear: a narrative of noble suffering and transcendent love that honored their grief and memories. "In his final days," Elena said, pausing to compose herself, "Trevor spoke often about the people who'd shaped his life. His mother Margaret, who taught him faith. His friend Nathan, who showed him loyalty. All of us who were blessed to know him learned something about what it means to love unconditionally." She looked directly at me as she said those words, and for a moment I almost believed her performance myself. Elena had always been gifted at creating the reality she wanted others to see. "Trevor's physical body may be gone," she concluded, "but his spirit lives on in all of us who were touched by his kindness, his strength, and his unwavering belief in the power of love. We are better people for having known him, and we honor his memory by striving to love as deeply and completely as he did." The applause was heartfelt and sustained. Elena returned to her seat with tears streaming down her face, accepting whispered condolences from those around us. Margaret reached over to squeeze her hand, clearly moved by the eulogy. "That was beautiful," Margaret whispered. "Trevor would have loved it." Elena squeezed back, then leaned against my shoulder as if overcome by emotion. "I hope I did him justice," she murmured. "You did," I said, putting my arm around her. "Now it's my turn." I stood and made my way to the podium, my heart pounding but my resolve absolute. This was it. The moment that would either destroy Elena or destroy me. There was no middle ground. "Thank you all for being here," I began, looking out at the familiar faces in the congregation. Trevor would have been amazed to see how many lives he touched, how many people considered him family. I paused, letting my eyes find Elena in the front row. She was watching me with love and pride, completely confident in her performance and my continued ignorance. "Before I share my own memories of Trevor," I continued, "I want to honor a final request he made. In his last moments, Trevor asked me to share something with all of you. Something he said was important for everyone to know." Elena's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had no idea what Trevor might have said in his final moments, but she knew it couldn't be good for her. "Trevor wanted you to know the truth about his final months," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now silent sanctuary. "The truth about the people who were really there for him during his darkest hours." I nodded toward the back of the sanctuary, where Blake was stationed near the audio controls. The large screens that had been displaying photos suddenly switched to a different image. Security footage from the oncology center showing Elena and Trevor entering a private consultation room. A murmur went through the congregation. Father Timothy stepped forward from his position beside the altar, his hand raised. "I'm sorry, but this is highly inappropriate," he began. "This footage was taken 3 weeks after Trevor's diagnosis," I said, raising my voice over the priest's objection. "The woman you see with him isn't a concerned friend, she's his lover of 7 years. 2 years before my marriage and all 5 years during it." "Sir, I must insist you stop this immediately," Father Timothy said more forcefully, moving toward the podium. But the congregation was erupting around him. Gasps of shock, confused murmurs, the scraping of chairs as people turned to stare at Elena. The priest hesitated, caught between his duty to maintain order and the obvious distress of his parishioners. Elena remained frozen in her seat, her face the color of ash, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "But that's not the worst of it," I continued, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Trevor told me something else before he died. Elena knew about his cancer from the very beginning. She attended every appointment, participated in every treatment decision, and continued their affair throughout his illness." The screens switched to a new image, text messages between Elena and Trevor during his chemotherapy treatments. The congregation fell silent as they read Elena's complaints about Trevor's weakness, her demands for better performance despite his illness. "The woman who just spoke so movingly about Trevor's courage," I said, my voice dripping with disgust, "sent him these messages during his final week of life." Margaret let out a strangled cry and collapsed in her seat. Elena's sister Samantha, who was sitting a few rows back, stood up with her face twisted in horror. "This can't be real," Samantha called out. "Elena would never—" "There's more," I said, cutting her off. The screens now displayed the recovered conversations between Elena and Samantha, the strategic discussions about how to manipulate the situation if Trevor died. The sanctuary was in complete chaos now. People were shouting, crying, trying to process what they were seeing. Elena finally found her voice. "Nathan, stop this!" she screamed, standing up and facing the congregation. "He's having a breakdown. This is fake. He's doctored these messages." "The private investigator who compiled this evidence is here today," I replied calmly, "as are copies of all the original files for anyone who wants to verify their authenticity. Phone records, medical records, security footage, financial statements. It's all real, Elena." Father Timothy was trying to restore order, but the congregation was beyond control. Margaret had to be supported by two family members as she processed the revelation that her son's final months had been poisoned by the very person she'd thanked for her compassion. "You want to know what kind of person my wife really is?" I shouted over the noise. While Trevor was dying, while he was too weak from chemotherapy to even keep food down, she was complaining that he was useless in bed. While his mother prayed for his recovery, Elena was strategizing about how to use his death to manipulate me into being a more attentive husband. Elena tried to run for the exit, but Blake had positioned himself there with a box of evidence. She turned back toward the altar, trapped between the truth and the congregation that now understood exactly what she was. "The woman who spoke about Trevor's belief in unconditional love," I continued, my voice carrying over the chaos, "exploited his love while he was dying. She took advantage of his weakness, his illness, his desperate need for human connection, and used it all for her own gratification." The congregation was turning on Elena now. People were standing, pointing, shouting accusations. Someone called her a monster. Someone else demanded she leave the church immediately. "He loved you," Margaret screamed at Elena, her voice breaking with rage and grief. "My son loved you, and you tortured him while he was dying." Elena's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," she shrieked back. "Trevor was obsessed with me. He wouldn't let me go. I tried to end it, but he threatened to tell Nathan everything." The admission hung in the air like a poison cloud. Even Elena seemed to realize she'd just condemned herself further. "So you killed him with kindness instead?" I asked, my voice cutting through her hysteria. "Convinced him you cared while you bled him dry emotionally?" Elena looked around the sanctuary desperately, searching for any face that might show sympathy or understanding. She found none. The same people who'd been moved to tears by her eulogy now looked at her with disgust and revulsion. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and venomous as she faced me. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's been over since the moment Trevor told me the truth. Everything since then has just been you digging your own grave deeper." Elena pushed past the people blocking her path and fled the sanctuary. The sound of her heels echoing off the stone floors was the last anyone in that room would hear from her for a very long time. The wake continued, but it was no longer about Trevor. It was about processing the revelation that someone they'd all trusted and admired was capable of such cruelty. Margaret needed medical attention. Several people left immediately, unable to reconcile what they'd learned with their memories of Elena. But others stayed. They stayed to support Margaret, to share genuine memories of Trevor, and to begin the process of healing from a different kind of betrayal than they'd expected to face that day. Blake found me outside the church as the crowd was finally dispersing. "It's done," he said simply. "Your wife's car is gone, and I suspect she won't be back anytime soon." "What happens now?" "Now you start over," Blake replied. "The divorce will be straightforward given the evidence. The prenup you signed will protect most of your assets." "And Elena?" He shrugged. Elena will have to live with what she's done becoming public knowledge. I looked back at the church where Margaret was still surrounded by family and friends. She'd lost her son, and today she'd learned that his final months had been more painful than she'd ever imagined. But she'd also learned the truth, which was something Trevor had wanted her to know. "Do you think he's at peace now?" I asked. Blake considered the question seriously. "I think your friend died knowing he'd done the right thing by confessing. That has to count for something." I drove home alone that evening, to a house that would never feel like home again. Elena's belongings were gone. She'd clearly returned while everyone was at the church and taken what she could carry. Her wedding ring sat on the kitchen counter next to a brief note. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I loved you both in different ways. I'm sorry." I threw the note away without reading it a second time. Elena's version of love wasn't something I wanted to understand. 6 months later, the divorce was final. The legal proceedings had been surprisingly straightforward, given the overwhelming evidence of Elena's adultery. I'd filed on grounds of adultery and emotional cruelty, serving papers 3 weeks after the wake when Elena had finally emerged from whatever hole she'd crawled into. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed before marriage proved invaluable. Elena had insisted on it initially, confident she'd never be the one at fault in any dissolution. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her infidelity voided any claim to spousal support, and the evidence Blake had compiled made challenging the terms impossible. I retained the house, my retirement accounts, and my business assets. Elena received only what she'd brought into the marriage, which, as it turned out, was very little beyond debt she'd hidden from me. Her interior design business had been built primarily on my connections and financial backing, and those clients disappeared once the story of her manipulation became public knowledge. The settlement required Elena to sign additional non-disclosure agreements, preventing her from selling her story or attempting to profit from the scandal. Not that anyone would have been interested in her version of events. Elena had moved across the country within a month of the divorce filing, and our mutual friends had universally cut ties with her. The story of what happened at Trevor's wake had spread through our social circle like wildfire, ensuring that Elena's reputation preceded her wherever she went. Margaret and I developed an unlikely friendship born from shared grief and betrayal. She told me stories about Trevor's childhood that he'd never shared, and I told her about the friend I'd known before cancer, and Elena's manipulation had destroyed him. "He was a good man who made terrible choices," Margaret said one afternoon as we visited Trevor's grave. "But in the end, he tried to make it right." "I keep wondering if I could have saved him somehow," I admitted. "If I'd been paying closer attention, if I'd seen the signs earlier." "Elena was a predator," Margaret replied firmly. "Predators are skilled at hiding in plain sight. You couldn't have known because she didn't want you to know." She was right, but the guilt lingered. I'd failed to protect my best friend from the woman I'd brought into our lives. I'd been so focused on building a future with Elena that I'd missed the signs that she was destroying the person I cared about most. But Trevor's final confession had been a gift, even wrapped in betrayal and pain. He'd given me the truth, and the truth had set me free from a marriage built on lies. It had also given me the power to ensure that Elena couldn't continue manipulating people with impunity. The wake revelation had been brutal, but it had been necessary. Some truths are too important to die with the people who know them, and some people are too dangerous to leave unexposed. Trevor was gone, but his final act of courage had saved me from wasting the rest of my life on someone incapable of genuine love. In the end, that was the greatest gift a friend could give.